Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. As some of you know, I've been painting more with gouache paint in the last year, and what I didn't mention is that it always felt like a huge ordeal compared to watercolor, since gouache is best used fresh from the tube. This meant squeezing out new paint every time that I wanted to paint. You can let your paint blobs dry and reactivate them, like I did in the beginning with this small kind of portable palette, but I found that they get crumbly and aren't as nice to paint with. You can see this here, they get really dry and they start cracking, and I found that you don't get really all of the advantages of gouache when you let them dry like this. So although I recommended setting up a small palette like this for field work, I don't know if I would do it again like this today. So I just want to show you the difference between dried gouache that's reactivated and then fresh paint. And here you can see the same palette before I cleaned it and refilled it, and I'm just trying to reactivate the dried bit of yellow ochre that I have here. And you can see I'm working on it quite a bit, trying to get the paint moist and smooth again, and it's nearly impossible. The paint is really brittle and grainy, and also it doesn't really have very good opacity. So when I apply it over a darker layer of paint, it doesn't really cover anything. And now let's take a look at the same paint that's squeezed fresh out of the tube. And this is gold ochre, by the way. It's a really nice color. So I just have to add a tiny bit of water. So there's almost no water on my brush because I want it to be really opaque, and the only way to get these opaque, almost dry brush effects with gouache is when you use it fresh from the tube. And I'm not sure if you can see this in the video, but there's really a difference in the application of these two brush strokes. As you can see, I'm blotting my brush onto the paper towel to remove any kind of excess water, and here you can see it's really opaque, it's covering up the area below. And when I add a second layer, it's almost non-visible that there's blue beneath it. So this is the reason why you should use gouache as fresh as possible if you can. It really makes a difference in paint application and also in the opacity of the paint. During my first steps with gouache, I tried out all kinds of different palettes that I had available, and in the first few months I ended up with a simple flat palette, a metal palette that I cleaned every time after painting. So I added a thin strip of paper towel for the paints to sit on so that they stayed moist during painting, and I simply squeezed out a little bit of paint. And you can see this in some of the demonstration videos in the gouache tutorials that I already did. So this worked, but it felt like a lot of hassle, and a lot of unused paint went to waste, and I don't like this. So paint is rather expensive, and I never took it with me anywhere. That was the other point. So this was a solution that worked in the studio, but I didn't like it for taking with me outdoors. And then I happened to buy an airtight plastic palette at some point that I saw another artist use. So it looks like this. And I have to say I usually like metal palettes better, but I figured I should at least give it a try. And somehow this made painting with gouache much easier and more practical. And I'll show you how it looks on the inside. So you have these small compartments that you can squeeze paint into, and then you have this huge mixing area. And I have to say this made painting with gouache much easier and more practical. So the paint here stays moist in between the sessions. If you paint every few days, then this works very well. If you let your paint sit in there longer for a few weeks or maybe even months, then of course it will crumble and dry at some point. But when you paint every few days, then you don't have to throw away your paint any longer, and that's a big plus, at least for me. So this is a palette by a company called Mijello or Mijello. I'm not sure how it's pronounced. It's the Mijello Fusion Folding Palette, and it comes with 18 wells, and it has these 3 mixing areas. It closes fairly airtight, although it's not sold as a stay wet palette or anything, but it still works that way for gouache. And this means that the paint stays fresh and moist between sessions. I usually add a little drop of glycerin to help my older paints stay moist for a longer time. So when I squeeze in fresh paint, I simply add a tiny drop of glycerin, and then it will mix when I pick up paint. And I haven't had any mold problems so far, except for the ivory black, which is an organic pigment. So, mold can happen, but as I said, I only had this kind of problem one time. And the palette has this nice insert, this clear plastic insert that you can simply take out for cleaning. So this is the other thing that I find really practical. When I want to clean my mixing palette, I simply can take out this plastic insert and clean it under the tap. I always find it's a big mess to clean palettes with these integrated kind of wells, because if you run water over it, then the paint will all come out, water will get everywhere on the paint, and now I take out the insert, clean it with a brush, and then in the sink, and then I put it back in. The only thing that's not that great is that this is a little bit fragile, so it already has a crack, but you have to treat it if you treat it carefully, then I suppose it will work for a longer time. So overall, I'm really happy with this palette, and the only thing that I don't sort of like is the size. So it's huge. You can see it sort of fits 2 of my hands on here. I'm not sure if I want to put it in my bag like this. I haven't tried painting plein air paintings with this one, but I think I will have to think of a good system to fix this to my support board and still have some space for the sketchbook. So when I'm painting outside, I use these Coroplast plastic support boards and then simply clip my palette on at some point. And I don't think it will work as well with this really huge palette. But I've seen other painters carry around palettes that were of similar size or even the same palette, so I think it's definitely possible. I simply haven't tried it, so I don't know yet if it fits my working style. So I'm really happy that I discovered this kind of palette. The company has a number of similar palettes with different layouts and wells, and I chose the smallest one with just these 18 wells because that's all I need. There are similar plastic palettes that you can get for a very good price, but I think they're usually not airtight. So when I start a new painting sessions, I usually add a little bit of water on the paint with a spray bottle to activate it and make it moist a little bit better to pick it up with a brush. And I also refill any wells that need new paint because, the fresh paint, fresh from the tube, is usually best. And then when I'm done, I simply close the palette and the paint stays fresh for the next session. As I said, if you paint every few days, then this works great. If you paint, I don't know, once a week or once every 2 weeks, it still works, but you need to work a little bit in the wells to get the paint out. I recently paused my gouache painting activities for a few months, and as I expected, the paint was all dried and cracked, and I had to replace it with fresh paint. So this stay wet option doesn't work for any longer periods of time. But I have to say, this palette setup is still much better than throwing away dried paint after every session, so it still saves a lot of paint. So enough talking about this great new palette. What colors did I put in it? I filled the palette except for one well, which I'm currently using as a place to put my clamp in. So if I want to take this with me, then I have a clamp that will go here probably. So here are the colors. I have zinc white and titanium white, then lemon yellow, permanent yellow deep, yellow ochre, chrome orange, cadmium red light, then a bit of purple magenta and carmine red. Then the empty well, you could put dioxazine violet in there if you wanted, ultramarine blue, phthalo blue, viridian, sap green, May green, burnt sienna, raw umber, Van Dyke brown and ivory black. For me, this is a well-balanced palette that gives me more than enough mixing choices. You can of course use a more reduced palette. When I was still working with fresh paint for every session, I used approximately 6 colors at the most. And I find that I usually use a limited number of colors for each painting. So it keeps the range of colors smaller, and often paintings seem better composed with limited colors, because all of the mixes that you do work well together. But with this kind of palette, you definitely have all the choices that you need. All of the paints in my palette are either Winsor & Newton Designer's Gouache or Schmincke Designer's Gouache or Horadam Gouache. So I still have a tube of Royal Talens Extra Fine, which is a nice kind of paint, but it's increasingly hard to get here, and it's also very crumbly when you leave it to dry for a few days. And I think with this kind of palette you could probably even try out using cheaper gouache paint that doesn't reactivate so well or gets more crumbly, because the paint stays moist for longer. But I have to say, I don't bother anymore with the really cheap stuff, because it's usually difficult to paint with and it isn't as bright and as intense. So I really prefer these sort of mid-priced designer's gouache paints, which have great quality and last also a very long time. So for gouache, I usually don't pay as much attention to single pigment paints as with watercolor. I have a couple of 3 pigment mixes and they perform really well for mixing. If you know how to mix them together, then this is not a problem. And then a note about the whites. If you only want to use one white, then you should choose the titanium white. It's more opaque and you can cover dark areas when you mix it with other colors, and also when you're using it on its own. I added the zinc white to my palette because I still have this huge tube of it. And I also find it a good white for mixing. So it's a bit more gentle, it's not as opaque, and it doesn't cool down the color as much as the titanium white. But it's also, as I said, it's less opaque and it won't cover dark areas as well as this permanent titanium white. So I hope this is a helpful overview for those of you wanting to try out gouache and want to set up their own palette. I have found that painting with this setup means that I'm fighting less with gouache as a medium. It's still a bit finicky for me. I come from watercolor and I'm used to being able to reactivate paint after years and having it, nice and juicy and moist. And this is just not possible with gouache. So you want to use it as fresh as you can, straight from the tube if you can. And with this setup, I find I can concentrate more on the act of painting itself. I think it's really important to find the tools that work great for you, and I still find myself going back to watercolor very often because I'm just more comfortable with handling it. But with this setup, I reach out for gouache paints more often, and I really like this because I want to learn more about it, and I want to be more comfortable with using my gouache paints. So I would love to hear from you if you have tried out gouache and what your setup does look like, and what's your experience with different palettes and different kinds of paints. So if you like, leave me a comment below. That's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, feel free to like, share and subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!